So welcome, everyone. It's very good to see so many old friends in this tonight's meeting, which is, I think, the 28th or the 29th meeting of the Philosophical Cafe. Tonight, we will talk about books, but we'll talk about books in a different way than we talked about books in our previous meetings. Philosophers tend to talk about books as texts. Tonight, we will learn to see books as objects. And in doing so, or in order to do so, we will enter together in a beautiful old collection, in one of those places that some of us miss so much during the pandemics, an old book collections in a fantastic library. And once in there, we will learn to play a bit book detectives under the guidance of our special guest tonight, Professor Scott Mandelbrote. Scott, good evening. It's very good to see you. Together with Grigore, Vida, and Alexandru Liciu, we will try to ask questions while looking and listening to everything that it will happen in this fantastic library. But first of all, I wanted to ask Alexandru Liciu, who was in the library that we are talking about, to introduce us to the place a bit and to introduce our guest tonight. Alex, you have
Yes, thank you, Dana. Professor Mandelbrote is a well-known figure in the field of early modern intellectual history. He wrote extensively on natural theology, biblical criticism, the history of the book, and the figure of Isaac Newton, among other things. But of equal importance for us tonight is the fact that Professor Mandelbrote is the librarian of Perth and World Libraries, the libraries of Peterhouse, the oldest college of the University of Cambridge, in which he teaches a class entitled The Book. Welcome to our cafe, Professor Mandelbrote.
Scott, you're muted.
You're muted. You are muted, Professor.
Sorry. I'm just saying I'm missing a trick that I need. So if you'd just like to wait for a second whilst I set something up.
Well, this is how book detectives begin. They are hiding in the dark.
Then I will be with you. Sorry, I realized all this, lots of fussing about lights, and I haven't actually got the one thing that I really need, which is a camera. But there we are. Now no, it hasn't yet. So yeah, okay. Do you want to begin then?
I think Alex did have
well,
something
I was just introducing you. So maybe you'd like to say some words now, or should they? I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit about how you started to see books as material objects rather than mere text.
Okay. Well, I mean, I suppose my interests in this come from three places. One is, which is probably the oldest, is an interest in intellectual history, and therefore an interest in what one can find out about the way in which people thought in the past, which involves tracing, in my mind, not only reading what they write, but tracing how they come to write what they write and thinking about the sources that they used and the way that they developed their ideas. And fairly rapidly, it seemed to me, and it seemed to a relatively large number of intellectual historians, I suppose, in the course of my career, that one of the interesting ways of doing this is to think in terms of what people read and of the ways that they read. So that's one material interest in the history of books. I suppose the second interest would be a personal one, which is that I have for a long time acquired books for myself, and therefore have been interested in acquiring books that were more unusual or better connected with my research than other books. And that makes you interested again in the form and format of books, as well as in their immediate contents. If all you were interested in the contents of a book, you buy the most recent and probably cheapest edition, possibly. Though I'll try and show you why that's not a good idea. And then I suppose the third reason is most recent, would be because I've ended up being, as part of my employment, being in charge of a library of, well, books, I suppose, from the 11th century onwards, 12th century, I suppose, well, yeah, end of the 11th, beginning of the 12th century onwards. And that, of course, makes one aware of the importance of conserving and taking care of the material heritage of implied in books by collections of books, and that involves decisions about all sorts of things to do with their best environment for keeping them healthy, and also, of course, decisions that one might need to make about conservation, which are always, to some extent, decisions about what to preserve and what to alter, which have to be informed by one's knowledge of what people are going to want to look for in the future. And in my lifetime, not, I think, in my professional lifetime, but in my lifetime as a denizen of the planet Earth, I would say that people's views on that have changed quite considerably, and people's views have changed away from providing for the cheapest and most efficient means whereby someone can consult the text of an object, to being much more concerned with preserving the object in as close as possible to the historical form that it comes down to us, and preserving as much evidence of that form as possible for future users and viewers. So I hope that gives you some idea anyway. Do you want me to sort of do a quick cast round the room so people can see where I am?
That would be great. Please do that.
I'll have to unplug all the things I've just plugged in now to do that, but let's see what we can manage.
Since we promised a visit in the library, here is the visit in the library.
I'm sorry, you can see lots of lights and things which aren't normally there, and also lots of screens, but hopefully you saw a little bit. I didn't see what you saw, so saw a little bit of the place as well, which is a 17th century library room filled mainly with 16th and 17th century printed books.
So the convention of the game tonight was that you are going to show us some of your favorites and tell us something about what we can learn from a book without reading it.
Yes. Well, there are various things that I thought that I could show you. Shall we start again with Francis Bacon? Does that appeal to you, Dana?
Yes, I would love to see again the Instauratio Magna, and while you are preparing the camera, I'm going to tell the story of how I discovered that book. I think in the British Library, or perhaps before that in Oxford. I don't even remember when I saw it for the first time, a copy of the first edition of Francis Bacon Instauratio Magna, while I was looking for Francis Bacon Novum Organum. And I remember my astonishment when I realized that Francis Bacon, Novum Organum, a book that we all learned in school about, and it's part of the Faculty of Philosophy everywhere, part of the teaching and learning in the Faculty of Philosophy. So I remember my astonishment when I realized that Francis Bacon's Novum Organum doesn't exist like that at the beginning of the 17th century, but it appeared for the first time under a very different name and under a very different form, the form that Scott is going to show us tonight.
You've got to let me screen share.
Oops, I'm sorry. I'm going to let you screen share. Now you should be able to screen share.
Oh, sorry, that was my fault.
This is just extending the suspense. It's not so
Sorry.
easy to see a first edition of Francis Bacon book. I can assure you that it's not an easy thing to find and see and keep in your hands.
Now, can you see that, or do I need to share my screen first?
You need to share your screen first.
That's fine. Sometimes it just does it automatic as a default, but
yeah, now we see it.
right. Okay. Yeah, the issue that I want.
And I also made you the co-host of the meeting.
That's what I wanted to do. Now I hope you can see it a bit better.
Yes.
Good. We were thinking about judging books by their covers, and we were thinking about what one can learn simply from the covers of the book. This book is indeed the Instauratio Magna, as you can see, by Francis Bacon. I'll just move it up slightly so you can also see that it was given to the collections of my college by the widow of Theodore Gulston, who was president of the College of Physicians in London, but directly by his widow in 1635, so 15 years after its publication in 1620. But what's perhaps most interesting about it is the binding that it's in, which tells us that the book was almost certainly given to Theodore Gulston by its author, by Francis Bacon. And it tells us that through this remarkable gilt impressed stamp of the boar, which is a feature of many books given away by members of the Bacon family, not just actually by Francis Bacon, but certainly many books given away by Francis Bacon. And this style of binding in what used to be much cleaner, creamier, limp vellum, you can't really see the color very well, I'm afraid, but it's a kind of cream color of limp or unstiffened, barely stiffened parchment with gilt tooling, restrained gilt tooling, and it would have had green silk ties to set off the book and to keep it together as well. This pattern of binding is actually very common in early 17th century England, especially on books which are being given away, books which are presents of one kind or another, in this case, probably a present from the author. And I'll just show you the spine of the book. The label, I'm afraid, is probably later, but you can just see that it's also tooled rather nicely in gilt, though much of that sadly has worn off. But this is a present with a joke, perhaps implied in its form of presentation. The pig on the front, obviously bacon, but clearly not. I mean, he could have put a coat of arms or something else there, but instead he and his family chose that the way they would mark their books was with a pig. So that is an example of something which one can learn from the cover of this book. If the covers didn't survive, if it had been replaced by a modern binding, we'd know something about its history because of that inscription. But we wouldn't know everything about its history by any means. And we'd be missing at least one very important point. We'd also be missing the fact that it belongs to a small group of copies of this book, all of which are bound in the same way. All of them, in fact, presentation copies of one kind or another. So again, one wouldn't just be missing evidence about this individual copy, one would be missing evidence more generally about both Bacon's intentions in publishing and distributing the book, and about the range of surviving copies from that edition of the book. So in this case, it seems to me that the book's cover is actually quite important to us in understanding not just this copy, but also the broader edition of the Instauratio Magna, and in a small way, Francis Bacon's intentions in writing that book, or at least in publishing that book.
So I guess one question that arises now is, whom was the book bound for? In this case, it was Francis Bacon, but more generally, for whom would a book be bound? Was it the author? Was it the reader? Was it the bookseller? And even more generally than that, how many people were involved in the production of a book?
Well, I've got various things that I can share with you which answer that question. And I'll just need to rearrange slightly in order to do that. I thought we could begin possibly with a book which I expect I'll show you several times because it illustrates a number of points, but with a book in the state in which it would usually leave the publisher in, or the bookshop indeed, not just the publisher, in the 17th century. So this, as you can see, is a little book, and it's a book without any cover at all. It is folded, the sheets are folded. In fact, the sheets are, as you can see, uncut, so it's quite hard to read this book at the moment. And they're held together by a simple single thread, which has been stabbed through the gatherings. You can see the gatherings that make up the sheets of the book, I think quite clearly here, and stabbed through there and tied in a simple knot. So that is, without a cover, is how certainly a small book like this would have left the shop in the 17th century. Obviously then, I mean, it's also the case that some books leave the shop in slightly grander form. So I'm not actually sure that this is an example, quite an example of what I wanted to show you. I should have brought something else as well. This is, as you can see, a very finely bound book, very handsome book, lots of high quality leather, lots of gilt decoration, nice gilt decoration on the spine, which has unfortunately faded a bit, little leather and silver clasps to hold the book closed. you can probably, yes, if I get the light right, you can see gilt edges as well. So smart little book. Whether this book was bound for its first owner, or whether it was bound in this way by the bookseller who sold it, I'm not quite sure. There's nothing distinctive about the binding, although it is a high quality binding. And the book itself is, although possibly a little early for what I'm describing, an excellent example of the sort of book that booksellers did sell bound, and bound in this kind of attractive Christmas present-y way, but with nothing very special or specific about the binding. And that is, in this case, it's a book of common prayer with Psalter. So it's the sort of book that you might buy to carry with you to church, and the sort of book that you might want to give away to your children if you were sufficiently wealthy, or possibly to your wife, or wife to her husband. And there are records, particularly from the late 17th century. This book can't have been bound before 1635 because that was when it was published. But particularly from the late 17th century, there are records in the London book trade and elsewhere of people having ready-bound books of this kind, books of practical piety, Bibles, prayer books, for sale, and always, pretty much always, bound with this kind of bling attached to them, because they were intended to be purchased as gifts. A little bit later on, people do start, those same records do start to show people selling books, often books that were being sold in bulk for people to buy and distribute to poor people or to their parishioners, or to their friends. And you get alternative choices for how the book can be ordered. It can be ordered stitched, as we've seen. It can be ordered in cheap bindings, so sheep or calf, and sometimes it can be ordered in these grander bindings. So you could buy a book from the bookseller bound. Books are also distributed not just by their authors, but also by institutions bound. So this is a book. This book is again one of a fairly common group of books which start publishing in the late 16th century. This is a set of congratulatory poems produced by the University of Cambridge and printed by its printer, Roger Daniel, in 1640, on the birth of a new child of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. And this allows the university press both to show off some of its some of its range of type. I'm sure if I look hard, I failed to mark it. Oh yes, there's an example. You can find Greek type, probably Greek poetry being composed by Cambridge alumni. Probably also, no, I'm not succeeding in finding it, some Hebrew type. Anyway, this book was bound by a man called John Holden, who's a Cambridge bookseller, and there are a whole series of this book and its fellows amongst late 1630s Cambridge imprints of this kind of congratulatory verses, bound in exactly this style. Again, you can see limp vellum with some fairly standardized gilt decoration. You can also see that it had gilt edges, I hope, and in this case just a plain spine. But that is a book, again, although we don't know to whom this book was given away, it's a book being bound for presentation, in this case by the publisher rather than by the bookseller, and effectively by the University of Cambridge. Just to take your example a little bit further, again with a book from the 1630s. This is a book which was bound for the purchaser, but the purchaser was an institution, not an individual. In this case, Peterhouse in Cambridge, who put their stamp very firmly, had the binder make a stamp that in the 1630s that they put very firmly on this book, which was in fact a book specially printed for them and for use in their chapel. So the book is a book of common prayer, but that isn't specially printed for them. That was obtained from a bookseller. But this book which accompanies it, text of the Psalms in Latin, was specially printed for them, was in fact specially printed for them by one of the king's printers in London, and was then sent up to be bound by their Cambridge binder with this stamp of the institution on it. So that's an institutional binding on a book which is specially made for an institution. And then we have potentially.
We can break just a little bit to take a question from YouTube. Maybe stop share screen just for the moment so that we see each other. Because it's a very interesting and I think it's an important question for our audience. So Dragos is asking on YouTube, Scott, I see you are handling the books quite confidently without any obvious protective measures such as gloves. What can you tell us about the paper quality, and are books durable or?
Books are extremely durable. One of the best ways to damage books is to wear gloves, because you lose the feeling at the end of your fingers if you wear gloves, and therefore can tear paper or damage bindings. Leather bindings of all kinds benefit from handling because they like being slightly greasy, and the more you handle them, the happier they will be, as long as you handle them carefully. The thing I haven't got here, mainly because the angle interferes with the camera, is a cradle to put the books on. If I were giving you the books, I would probably want you to put them on a cradle so that you couldn't open them too far or lean on them too heavily and would have some weights to hold them down. I'm very used to handling them, and I'm quite confident that I'm not going to do them any damage in the way that I handle them. I was just going to run through some choices of a purchaser of a book, if you are happy with that.
We can do that. I just wanted to tell people on Zoom as well that we are waiting for questions, and just let us know that you want to ask something, and we will introduce the question in the discussion.
So many of the books in this library belonged to a man called Andrew Pern, who frequently, well, this is actually a very bad example, though he has put his initials there. More frequently, he puts AP, I'll show you in a minute, in ink on the title page. The college had a bookplate made in 1592 to record the donation, so it's easy enough to know that this is a book that belonged to Andrew Pern, or at least assuming the book label is in the right place. But we're interested in the covers, and this is a very, very, very plain calf binding made for Andrew Pern. It's been slightly restored. I suspect that label is late. Well, that label is definitely later, so you should forget about that. It would have a plain calf spine, plain calf boards. The title, whilst it was in Pern's library, is written, as you can see, on the foredge, which is why I think the gilding on the spine is later. But this is a very simple binding, no decoration, except for Pern's initials and one stamp in blind in between. Actually, this is slightly more decorated than some of Pern's bindings. This has at least involved a payment to a binder to make that intervention in what is otherwise a very plain and relatively inexpensive binding. Whether the next stage up is this book, where you can see, again, AP in blind, but with the binder has been asked to run a single roll. He's done it, made 4 movements with his heated roll to produce this border, and he's also made a few lines either with a roll or with a knife, and again picked up the stitching and used another tool to put in the corners, and also another tool, again similar tool, flower tool, to put in some decoration around AP. But again, you can see the spine is very plain. All this decoration is in blind. So this is probably the next stage up in Pern's decorative work. And as you can see, he didn't actually write his name in this one at all. Probably about the same sort of cost, although possibly a little bit more expensive. This book, which, as you can see, is again very plain, but where the binder has put Pern's initials, little decoration, but used gold leaf, so a heated tool, which has then added gold leaf to the impressions that have otherwise been made in blind of these initials. So that's probably a little bit more expensive because gold is quite expensive. And then going on a little bit further in the choice of the binder, you can see the same binder, I think, who made this book, has also been asked to make this book. And in this case, Pern has gone a little bit further because he's asked the binder to try and make a special tool, a unique tool, not just his initials A and P, which the binder would have had those letters for lettering more generally, but a tool which will reproduce in gilt and allow the binder to set gilding in the middle of the board. The AP monogram that Pern is otherwise writing at the bottom of the title pages of many of his books. So that's more expensive because the binder has to make a special tool to produce this, although it's still in many ways probably a relatively cheap binding, a binding for somebody who's only a poor scholar and clergyman and not a very rich man, though he has a large library. Those are all calf bindings, although they're different colors. Sheep is cheaper than calf. Parchment, which we've also seen being used on expensive bindings. Parchment can also be very inexpensive. And then, of course, you can bind books in second-hand parchment, which is very, very cheap in the late 16th century indeed, because there's a lot of second-hand parchment coming onto the market in the libraries of dissolved monasteries and so on, and old books, medieval books that people don't want anymore now they've got printing. And you can reuse old parchment very successfully to bind new books. And we'll meet the owner of this book, who presumably had it bound in this way, or who may have bought it secondhand bound in this way, John Marrett, later in this talk as well. You can see actually he paid 4p for this book, so it really is a cheap book.
There is one question from Cristian Mladin. Cristian, would you like to say it?
Hello, do you hear me?
Oh, hello, you're in a nice place.
Yes, so Professor Mandelbrote, I would like to ask you something about the role of the ex libris. if it plays any role in the sense of the question that Alexandru was highlighting. So regarding the binder or the person whom the book was dedicated, so to speak.
Right. Well, if we go back to this book, this is an ex libris. It's an institutional ex libris. It was printed by the university printer in 1592. I know that because because I've got the bill that he sent in and that was paid. It's put in by the college after the books have been given to the college. Hearn himself doesn't have a book plate. Actually, very few people in England in the 16th century did. There are people who obviously have book plates in the 17th century, very commonly. Those book plates can record all sorts of things. They can record gifts, which is effectively what this book plate is doing, or they can record ownership, which is, well, very simply, is doing the same thing that that modern book plate in the book is doing. That's again is institutional ownership, but it does. Individual ownership is just the same. And yes, of course, you can trace histories of ownership through book plates. In fact, I was going to show you in a minute or two. I will show you a good example of that. In fact, maybe I'll show it to you now. Again, this is a slightly humorous story about judging a book by its cover. So if you saw this book, which, as you can see, is a book written by Hugo Grotius, the great 17th century Dutch legal humanist and historian. And it's actually his edition of a number of texts about the history of the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, the history of the Goths, the Vandals, and the Lombards. If you saw this book, you would probably not be very interested in it. You probably wouldn't want to spend much time on it because you'd think this is a very horribly rebound, very nasty copy of what is in fact an extremely common book. And you can look it up online and you'll have no problems with it reading it there. But the person who had this bound absolutely horribly in probably about 1970 or 1980 did something slightly strange. These are new end papers, but they did keep the book plates that were in the book. In this case, the book plate of Charles Huggins, rector of Chinnor in Oxfordshire, and at the back, a book plate with the motto Philos of Famur, which in fact belongs to the Musgrave family, and which has some manuscript at the bottom, case G, F8 Barnsley, which is in fact a description of where it stood in the library of the Musgraves' house, Barnsley Park. Musgrave family's books were, you can possibly actually also see what I think is a bookseller's pencil markings there. The Musgraves family's books were divided in the 20th century, and some of them were sold in the early 1920s from a house called Tame Park in Oxfordshire. And that almost certainly included this book. However, what those book plates allow one to tell about this book And so what one can tell from its cover, even its new cover, is that this was a book that belonged to Isaac Newton, because Isaac Newton's books were sold en bloc to John Huggins, Charles Huggins's father, in order to stock the rectory at Chinnor, which Charles Huggins had just been appointed to. This book is listed in the inventory of the books from Newton's library that were sold to John Huggins, and that later passed from into the Musgrave family from the rectory at Chinnor. So those two book plates allow one to identify this book, fortunately preserved in this otherwise absolutely horrible covers. They allow one to identify this book as belonging to Isaac Newton. And I can... I'm just having a quick hunt in the book to see if I can find anything else that identifies it as more recently, perhaps, anything else that is older that might be Isaac Newton's. So, that proof correction is probably in Newton's hand, but you wouldn't know that if you didn't know this was Newton's book. And similarly, a few pages back, these dog ears are in Newton's were made by Newton, but you wouldn't know that either. You can see there are two of them, one also from the top of the page. You wouldn't know that either if this didn't have those book plates that identified this as Newton's book, and therefore as the copy that was in the inventory. You'd know that Newton had owned a copy of this book, and you'd know that this particular copy had some things about it that made it a bit reminiscent of books that Newton owned. But without the fact that the person who had it rebound had kept those ex libris, you wouldn't be able to be sure that this particular one was indeed Newton's copy of this book. So I hope that helps answer your question a little bit.
I should mention that Christian works at the Batianeum Library, which
that's
some
the lovely library behind him.
Know quite well. Dan Garber has a question. Dan, would you like to say it loud?
Sure. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Dan.
Very nice to see you, and very interesting presentation. In a few of the bindings that you were talking about, when you were looking on the spine at the title, you indicated that the titles were added later.
Yeah.
Which made me wonder that when the book was on a shelf, how it is that people could have identified the book if it didn't have a title on the spine. So the title would have been on the other side of the book.
Biblia Septuaginta Latina, so which is what this book is, so Latin. So it's of course easier and cheaper to write on the edge of paper than it is to ask a binder to make, and this book, as you can see, has never had a label, to make a label for the book. It is possible to title directly to the spine so that you don't need to make a label. Labels also have a habit of falling off, and people do that as well. But they don't start doing that, at least in England, until the early 17th century. So, during the course of the 17th century, a lot of libraries turned round, as it were. You can, of course, write on other edges as well. So if your shelves, don't happen to have one, don't don't happen to have one to hand, but if your shelves aren't tall enough, or you just want to pile the books up, you could write on the bottom edge or the top edge, just as well as the long side edge. And indeed, Andrew Pern did that with some of his books.
That's interesting. It never occurred to me. But so the books would have been shelved with the title side out so that you would see them?
Yes, 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 that's right. That's how they were shelved. In the library I'm in, you can demonstrate that they were turned round. The books were turned round as part of, really as part of the construction of the library in its current form, which occurred between 1637 and 1656. By 1656, they had been turned round, and a new catalogue was made with the shelf marks that reflect that. And
the shelf marks would have been on the spine or on the edge of the paper?
Again, yes. Let me show you this one again. Although you can't. Although you can't see it very well in this example, that is actually a shelf mark put on by a librarian. And that shelf mark, which was put into this book in no later than 1656, is a shelf mark from the library once the books have been turned round. And so these are quite different marks. That shelf mark relates to the place on an unknown shelf in a library which no longer, a library room which no longer exists in the form in which that shelf mark applied to. This shelf mark relates to a position that I could actually find you in this library, although it may have changed slightly because shelves have been added. There are more shelves in the bookcases now than there were in 1656.
So one of the things that means, or that it would seem to imply, is that when books came from the bookseller, they were already cut and cut evenly. Because I'm sure that you've read old-fashioned French books where you have to sit with a knife and cut it as you're reading it, and the edge obviously is not going to be straight.
Well, I'll go back to the book I started with. This is a book as it comes from the bookseller. You can see the edges are not cut. These are rough edges.
Right.
And you can see that the top edge has not been cut at all, and in some cases the side edge is also uncut. So the person who does the cutting and who produces that nice smooth edge is the binder. And he does it with a very large plane, which is called a plough.
So
and he may, of course, later go on to decorate that edge as well, because particularly once you no longer need to write on the edge, if you're writing on the spine, it becomes possible to use that edge for other purposes, like, oops, no, I don't want to do that, like decoration. So this edge, you can see, has been marbled. All of these edges have been marbled. This is a late 17th century book. Just as some of the edges of the presentation copies that I showed you earlier were being gilded.
So the book would have come from the booksellers in sheets that were folded, but when you took it to your binder, then the edges would have been cut.
That's right.
And perhaps decorated.
That's right.
Thank you.
There is one question from Professor Reddy.
Shall I speak?
If you want to, yes, please.
Yes, well, this is absolutely fascinating, beautiful items, these books. But when I saw them, I realized that all of these books are printed. I was wondering if items, objects which were handwritten, copied, codexes would qualify as books from your perspective.
Oh yes,
And there's a more general issue here, which concerns the notion or concept of book. We can because one also can go back even beyond the codexes which were handwritten, say the scrolls, long things, book length but not bound, not cut, or the stones, the Hammurabi's books, as we call them occasionally. Would they qualify as books? Or you can also go to the other direction. Suppose you consider an electronic book which has never been printed. Would they qualify as books from your perspective? Or what makes an item a book, in other words?
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, everything that I'm looking at is a codex. And I would say that all of my comments can apply to any form of codex. So it doesn't matter whether the text is handwritten or not. And it doesn't really matter how long the codex is either. Clearly, from a textual point of view, rolls or scrolls and tablets, possibly also other forms of more durable material, sheets of bamboo that you can write on, for example, or even possibly the stones of buildings, very obviously, they convey texts. The laws of Gortin, to take an example, a very early example, Cretan example of of a text which is known and which exists as inscriptions on stone. It's definitely a text. In some sense, it's a book. But I don't think it's certainly not a codex, and I don't think it's a book in the terms that I'm talking about it. I don't actually think a roll or a scroll is a book in the form that I'm talking about it either. And I think those are books in the same sense that these codices may contain multiple books, the most obvious of which is the Codex of any Bible, which contains many books, many things which call themselves books, but which is only one, or sometimes more than one, but normally only one codex. The same, of course, can be true of scrolls. They can contain multiple books, not necessarily just one. But that's in the textual sense. But for my purposes, I'm treating all codices as books, and we're talking about the covers of. At the moment, we're talking about the covers of those books. Electronic books, of course, sometimes mimic the form of a codex, but more often mimic the form of a scroll. So if
Okay, I would also have a question on the direction that was started by Professor Redai. So, if you think about manuscript culture, what could you tell us, Professor Mandelbrote, about the manuscript culture and the invention of printing? Because I think I saw a piece of parchment in one of the bindings that you were showing us. So what?
Yes, I haven't really got anything terribly appropriate to hand, but I'll show you something which, although it's a printed book, is illustrative slightly of what we're talking about. In fact, is illustrative of it in a number of ways. So this book, which as you can see is rather large, is one volume of a printed book, a printed dictionary, early 16th century book, which was given, as we can see from this little piece of parchment that's been hammered onto its binding, was bound probably in Cambridge in the 16th century and was given to the library of my college by John Lowndes. You can see John Lowndes' name up there, who had died and had been a fellow of the college. This is you can also see that it's been later been titled here on the foredge, and that it has also a shelf mark, but those are later than this and represent a stage in the book's history which is later, because when this was made and the binding was made, this book was intended to stand on a lectern to which it had been chained. There are holes that actually go right the way through. You can see the light. Those two holes go right the way through the board and are the holes for a chain. For some reason, the binder put the plate on the wrong board and then had to move it. It's the same on all volumes of this book. But there are two holes for a chain. So this book was chained down onto a lectern where it sat, so you could see its title like this. It sat on a lectern like that, in a 16th century library in this college. And we have the shelf lists of that library, and they show that this printed book was on a shelf with a whole series of manuscript books that were similarly chained. But the binder who bound this printed book also had plenty of waste manuscript in his shop. And he used some of it to provide the paste down, so the strengthening of the binding for this book. And actually that's in many ways quite, well, I mean, that's a standard use of waste. And as we've seen with some of these little books that I showed you, you can see that also taking place there, that this is waste parchment, which actually constitutes historical parchment. Now, if I can find the right one, and it's being used, I mean, some of them are being used just to strengthen a binding which is otherwise plain. If I can find the right one, which I can't at the moment. It's probably one I've got out, actually. That's probably why. Oh yes, you can see that it is this one. This binding is actually made up of two different bits of parchment. It's got a fairly standard late medieval piece of probably English parchment being used for the front of the binding, but it's been stitched together. Much more interesting piece of manuscript waste. This is really very early. This is probably, this piece of manuscript is probably at least 400, possibly 500 years earlier than the book that it's binding. You can also see that. So this binding has been made up of two two scraps of parchment on this very inexpensive book, which cover hundreds of years actually of English manuscript and library culture. The rear piece may not have been written in England, the older piece. I mean, that's some evidence. There's evidence of destruction. I mean, obviously, there's also plenty of evidence of continuity. I mean, I could, of the things I happen to have to hand, I don't have anything which really shows continuity in terms of the manuscript book, because I haven't looked those out. But I have something which shows a different sort of continuity, which is the book list that this owner of a book decided to write on the blank paper conveniently provided for him by the binder at the back. So September the 16th, 1629, a note of all my books at Doddington. And you can see that he starts with, he's got music books and notebooks. These paper books are books of the notes that he's making at university on both grammatical and theological and classical topics, his commonplace book, and so on. But there are also manuscript music books that he owns in the 17th century. And then there are a lot of printed books, as you can see. There are then some more printed music books, which are printed music books rather than manuscript music books. So Dowland and Tomkins, for example. But there are also more manuscript music books, and then we've got the contents of his wardrobe as well. I mean, that's slightly frivolous, but I mean, it shows that at least in some respects, manuscripts and books continue to survive and continue to be, manuscripts continue to be a means of circulation of information well into the 17th century for certain kinds of information.
I would like to ask something. Historians of philosophy are usually thought of as dealing with disembodied ideas. It seems, though, that they miss something essential by ignoring the books in which those ideas are contained. Could you give us an example in which knowing more about a material book changed a certain interpretation about an author or a prevailing view? Maybe in the case of Newton, for instance, knowing more about the books that he owned, how did it change the perception of his works?
Well, I mean, I think knowing these things complicates one's perceptions of people because it alters the questions that you can ask. Whether it really changes, what it changes about what one thinks about an author is more complicated and depends partly on what level of involvement one thinks the author has in the text as well, and in changes that might be made in the text. I have an example that is sort of relevant to this, but it isn't unfortunately an example of a philosophical text. In fact, I have two examples which are relevant to this. One is a mathematical text and one is a historical text. I mean, I could show you those, or I could try and answer your question more directly and abstractly with reference to Newton, if you like. With reference to Newton, I would say that it's interesting to know, for example, that there are some alchemical books that he only obtains in manuscript and some that he obtains in print. So in some cases, he's had to get the book copied in order to have a copy of it, and in some cases not. I'd also say that the number of second-hand books that he owns that are alchemical books is interesting and tells us something about the efforts and pursuits of it that he's engaged in. I go further and in some cases say that there are books which Newton marked. There's a few books where Newton recorded the price, where sometimes it clearly indicates that he thought he got a bargain. And that might make one reflect differently on the status of that book, even if Newton then uses it in his work. Would he have ever been able to use that book if he hadn't got the bargain? So there are those sorts of questions. But I might show you some books which also illustrate an aspect of this, but which maintain the theme of judging a book by its cover. If I'm allowed to do that, would you let me do that?
But maybe before this, Professor Garber has a point exactly on this.
I was going to, in answer to Grigore's question, I have an example. It's slightly embarrassing, but nevertheless, I'll tell it. This was a number of years ago when Dana had been introducing me to Bacon. I got interested in the Silva Silvarum, and I had a thesis that the Silva Silvarum was directed at a more popular audience than Bacon's many of Bacon's other works, which of course had been published in Latin and were more learned. I thought, well, maybe this is something that is directed at a more popular audience, and had found some other comparisons that seemed to me apt, other books that were directed at a more popular audience. And I was visiting at All Souls and talking with Noel Malcolm, and suggested that. And he, I think knowing full well what we would find, said, that's an interesting suggestion. Let's look at a copy. And we went up to his rooms, and he pulled off the shelf a first edition of the Silva Silvarum, which was a large, elegant book with very heavy paper. It was very obvious that this was not an inexpensive book, that this was not the sort of book that would be directed at a popular audience. That's one thing that you can certainly learn from looking at the book itself, I think.
And another very good example, actually, which is not in any sense my discovery, it was Alexandre Koiré's and Bernard Cohen's discovery, is of course relates, but which is verifiable if you look at the books concerned, is the realization that Leibniz's comments on Newton's ideas about gravitation in some sense depend on the fact that he had been sent a copy of the Latin Optics, which contained a formulation of words which Newton later corrected, and so that he is actually writing about a text which Newton subsequently, before the edition was distributed entirely, Newton had changed. And this is a famous article that Cohen and Koiré wrote about the case of the missing tanquam, which is simply a stop press correction that and some copies had gone out to booksellers and binders before this correction was made, and Leibniz got one of those copies, which had one sheet of the book should have been cancelled and removed.
I think that another example is exactly the book we began with, namely Bacon's Instauratio Magna, that was completely, it's in a way, the 19th century edition and the 20th century Bacon scholarship was obliterating the fact that Bacon wanted his Novum Organum to be part of a composite volume, and that the volume looked like that. It took, I mean, if you didn't have the volume on your shelves, or you didn't see the volume in the library, you were just acquainted with the edition of Bacon's works, that would have been completely non-transparent to you. And a lot of the Baconianism of the 19th century is basically based on the false premise that Bacon intended Novum Organum to be a self-standing book, to be a book that was, you know, an individual, while it was not. It was part of that composite book. And, you know, 100 years of scholarship, William Whewell and Mill and all the others didn't know that.
Excellent. Well, shall I just show you an example of a book which actually intrigues me. I mean, I've got two examples effectively of the same thing, but which, again, relate to this question. So again, these books, I hope, all look fairly similar. They're all decorated in a pretty similar style. They're all quite horrible in some ways, but reasonably expensive bindings. Actually, this is the only one which really has very much of its original spine left. Again, forget the label probably. So they all roughly look the same, and in fact they are all the same in the sense that they are actually all copies, though with a different title of the text which is in this book, The Grand Cabinet Councils Unlocked, translated into English from French by Robert Codrington, and in no, that's the wrong one. Actually, those two are The Grand Cabinet Councils Unlocked, but this one has the variant title, The Memorials of Margaret of Valois, first wife to Henry IV, King of France and Navarre. Now, you'll find that the memorials of the Grand Cabinet's Councils Unlocked, or the Memorials of Margaret of Valois, if you look it up in the English Short Title Catalogue, translated by Robert Codrington, was first published in 1641. And you'll see a slightly puzzling history of the book. It seems to have been reprinted an awful lot. You won't find actually any of these three books, or in fact, this fourth book in the English Short Title Catalogue. And the reason for that is that actually textually, they are all unique, although they are, as you see, very similar. Dedication to the True Lover of All Good Learning, Thomas Clifford. Dedication to the True Lover of All Good Learning, the Truly Honourable Francis Finch. This to the truly noble, the true lover of all good learning and religion, Richard Blackwell. And this to the true lover of all good learning, again, the truly honourable Sir Edward Heath. Now, there are other differences between these books. 1656, 1661, 1657, and 1660. But they're actually all the same book. This is an example of, although they look textually, they look different in some ways, they have different dates of publication. The sheets are all from the same run. They are being reissued and sent out as gifts, with the only change being made at the top of the preface in each case. These are editions of with a print run of 1 being put together. The only thing that is changing is the title page and the dedication. And quite what is going on there, and you can see not even really the style of the binding that is being changed, although they are clearly intended for presentation. What is going on here, I do not know. I haven't been able to look at all the copies of this book. Some of them do exist as a normal book, but it almost it's either a very complex effort of the author to win patronage, or it's some very strange form of gift giving, which is going on around this single book. But it's complicated, and I don't quite know what to make of it. I've got a better idea in the case of this book, again bound for presentation, and you can see pretty much not quite identical, but very, very similar, basically identical bindings. The same tools being used in a slightly different pattern. And these are the tools of a Cambridge binder at the beginning of the 18th century. This one is dedicated to Dudley Cullum. And I think there may be other copies dedicated to Dudley Cullum. It's the second part of The Art of Sailing by the Logarithms by Daniel Newhouse, published in 1701. This one is not dedicated to Dudley Cullum. It's dedicated to the master of St. Peter's College in Cambridge. And it's actually one of several copies made specially for presentation to Cambridge colleges. Oh yes, and it also bears the dedication to Dudley Cullum. So this is an added leaf, unlike in the other cases where the dedication is unique. This is an added leaf, and there are several copies in Cambridge, in other Cambridge colleges dedicated similarly. So here the author is distributing his books as presents and making them that little bit more special by having a printed dedication leaf added. But he's having other copies bound in exactly the same shop and in exactly the same way. Whether or not, so there must be, again, hierarchies of presentation, I think, going on there. But that adds a slight complication of how stable are these texts that we're looking at?
Actually, this was a wonderful example of the unicity of the printed book. That was one of the points we wanted to make today. You have nicely proven that each book, no matter what the text is inside, even if the text in principle should be identical, it's unique, and in sometimes very, very, very seriously different from other copies of the same book. We do have
I should say that it's very difficult to find that information in library catalogues. I mean, it's possible to find some of that information, but by no means all of it. And actually, one of the Codringtons that I showed you, one of the Margaret of Valois books, I'm afraid those are my books, not the college's books. And one of them used to be an ESTC and now isn't, because I acquired it from a library in America which was sold. So an institutional library, which was sold. At that stage, it was the only, it was recorded as the only known copy of that edition, unsurprisingly, because it is, and that edition only had one copy, I think. But it's no longer in ESTC because ESTC surprisingly have removed the records of that library. So you can't find that book described online anymore, whereas you could, when I bought it, you could.
I have a question on YouTube that is very interesting from Mateus Monteiro. And the question is, can you tell us how the modern reader or the potential buyer of the book made sure about the authenticity of the text? because, for example, there were many versions of classical and philosophical texts that circulated among readers. Was that a concern for the 17th century reader?
Yes is the answer. I know I'm not. I can give you some good answers to this question, but I may need to get up to do it, I'm afraid.
All right. Maybe while you are doing that, we can collect more questions from our audience on the Zoom or the YouTube, so that we give you time to find the example.
I suspect I've got an example. Yes, I have an example here. I need one more. Just let me get up for a second.
Do we have questions or comments or things to collect so far? Because, of course, this question about the unicity of the book and the authenticity of the book opens up a whole theme of forgeries and book forgeries and book forgers and so on. We thought at some point that that might be an interesting thing to discuss.
Okay. Well, many 15th and early 16th century books answer your question, are aware of your question, and also perhaps aware of the need to help the binder, and they simply tell you. They tell you at the end of the book what you should find in the book. So this, tells you that you should find gatherings A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. In the book, and that and it tells you how many leaves you should find in those gatherings, except for the last one, where you find a different number of leaves in the gathering. So this book tells you precisely, it tells you physically what it requires to have in order to be textually complete. So that's one possible way of thinking about how a reader knows something is textually complete. A slightly different and more common form of treatment of that issue is the presence in books of things like this. So errata leaves, which tell you two things. They tell you both the mistakes that the printer has made and the fact that somebody has gone through the text looking for those mistakes, and therefore presumably that you can be confident that whether or not you correct these mistakes, what you have is otherwise a textually correct copy of the book. I'm not sure what level of confidence that necessarily inspires, but perhaps it inspires some. But clearly people made mistakes. One can buy books now printed and bound in the 16th or 17th centuries which are incomplete, and which were incomplete when they were bound. They're not incomplete because somebody's damaged them or taken something out of them. They've just always been incomplete. And similarly, one can find examples in libraries that are incomplete, and one can find examples also of people binding the sheets in the wrong order. And every mistake that can occur always does occur.
How about intention? Sorry, Alex, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask on this note, how reliable are then the bibliographic description then find online on sites like ESTC and so on and so forth, or the databases of diverse libraries, in order to see what you just shown us? Do you have to look at the book, or would it suffice to do a search on Google?
Well, in theory, a description given in a union catalogue, a good union catalogue, like the English short title catalogue, in theory, that will be correct. In practice, any catalogue is only as good as the cataloguers who've made it, and the more sources of information you have, the more likely you are to find that your information conflicts in one way or another. So even a good union catalogue will have mistakes in it. The commonest mistake it will have is a library claiming that it owns a copy of a book when in fact it owns a copy of a different book. That's a very easy mistake for somebody to make if they're in a hurry. But the person who produces the first record should have checked whether the book is complete in the form in which they've described it. But that, of course, is difficult if you haven't got access to other copies of the book. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. And the existence of electronic surrogates, because I know you want to talk about electronic surrogates, and that we should talk a bit perhaps about facsimiles as well. The existence of those doesn't necessarily help, because they are very frequently incomplete, particularly the ones prepared for Google, which represent a very large number of the surrogates available, because they often weren't prepared very carefully, and for example, fail to fold out leaves that fold out, fail to well, and have other problems. They also didn't check whether the copies they were digitizing were complete copies of books. So again, no, they digitized the copies that libraries allowed them to digitize. And of course, our knowledge will increase, and we'll have more digital copies available, and you'll be able to make more choices. I mean, I found I was doing some research a little while ago on the optics, Newton's optics, and I found one of Newton's own annotated copies of the optics online in the library of McGill University in Canada, which had digitized it. It's one of, I think, 16 copies which have been digitized. It was rather nice to find that copy, because John Harrison, who compiled the library catalogue of the catalogue of the Library of Isaac Newton and tried to locate surviving books from Newton's library, hadn't been able to find that. And McGill had made no song and dance about the fact that they had digitized this book. I only found it because I was looking at every single digitized copy online, because I was trying to make comparisons between them. So no, that was nice discovery to make, and it wouldn't have been possible without the digitization program at McGill. But it was an entirely accidental discovery.
Tell us, what do you prefer between a facsimile and a digital copy of a book, and why?
Okay, well, let me show you a couple of facsimiles. I'll show you, ideally, I'll show you 3 facsimiles, which have different forms, although 2 of them are facsimiles of the same book. So let me start with the book Whose Errata I just showed you. In some senses, this book is a facsimile. I mean, it's a facsimile only a little bit more obviously, actually, than the sense in which every book that you look at is a facsimile. And that is that the type that reproduces the Anglo-Saxon text here, the text of the laws of England, together. The text of the laws of England is also published by the same author. This is not the text of the laws of England. This is the text of Bede's History of the English People. is here being reproduced in 1643 in Cambridge by Abraham Wheelock, from using a type which, for the Anglo-Saxon, which emulates the manuscript of the Anglo-Saxon manuscripts he was using to edit the text, and that is indeed which emulates the type, the first Anglo-Saxon type cut in the 1560s, 1570s for the printing of first printing of Anglo-Saxon in England, again based on manuscript. As such, it's a little bit different from the italic letter form of the Roman, which is based on letter forms used by Roman stonecutters. So one is, but in both senses, these are facsimiles in some form. They are efforts to mimic in print the appearance of something else. In one case, manuscript. In one case, stone epigraphy. And clearly, actually, I'll show you another one. Facsimile is something which early modern authors were also interested in. This is actually a later book republishing the facsimiles, specimen of our manuscript, that were made for the publications of the Oxford antiquary Thomas Hearne in the early 18th century. And this is the character of a famous manuscript of the Acts of the Apostles in the Bodleian, of which Hearne was the first editor of the text drawn from that particular manuscript. So those are contemporary uses of facsimile. Show you another facsimile. This is obvious. This is, well, what is this book? Is this a book published in 1649, The Civil Wars of England, dedicated helpfully to Jehovah, and reprinting the earlier survey of England's champions? Is this a 17th century book? It looks quite like a 17th century book. There's nothing to tell you that it isn't a 17th century book. So let me leave you with this question. Is this a 17th century book, a copy of the Civil Wars of England, published in 1649? And I'll ask you the same question about this book. Is this a 17th century book, The Civil Wars of England, collected by John Lester, published in 1647, and which we can also turn the pages, possibly? My internet connection's good enough. Oh, well, that's helpful. Yes, and again, you see it's dedicated to Jehovah. And it has, it then has, I think I showed you that one actually as well, the illustrious and right honourable Robert Earl of Essex, and so on. So firstly, are these the same book? And secondly, what are we looking at in each case? What do people think? Over to you.
Well, it's obviously not the original book, but it reproduces it so well that you might think that you don't have to look at the original book anymore. Sorry,
which of the two is that?
Well, I'm afraid it was written there that it's a reprint of 1880.
Oh, I'm sorry. I showed you. I cheated, didn't I? I showed you what had been written at the front. Yes, you were able to see that. Yes, it's indeed. It's a 19th century. I showed you one 19th century reprint, 1830, I think actually, which bears nothing to say that it was printed in 1830, or indeed that it's a reprint. but which clearly is. And if you can see the paper, it's absolutely obvious. It's not quite so obvious from the type, although the type is different too. So yes, one of those is a 19th century reprint, facsimile reprint of the book. And the other, of course, is a 21st century digitization of a microfilm facsimile prepared in the 1970s of a 17th century book. That is what you're looking at when you look at, when you look at this. Come on. When you look at this, what you're looking at is a 21st century digitization, now actually reprocessed into a new browser. So the second edition of a 21st century digitization of microfilm made in 1975, roughly, of a 17th century book. But it doesn't tell you that. It doesn't tell you that anywhere on here, which is really quite scandalous. It just tells you that the latest iteration is 2019 of this digital presentation. So it's obscuring its bibliographical history from you, and you would have to get at that. Quite complicated for you to get at that, actually.
So there's nothing in the details if you go up in the details of the digital record. Full text and the details. Yeah. No, the other one, the details after.
No, the devil is in the details.
It does indeed tell you that its origin is a microfilm, but it doesn't tell you that explicitly. It only tells you that if you know that it was UMI's microfilm of 17th century English books that these were filmed from. So no, it doesn't tell you. And it doesn't tell you either that the digital platform, the images have been repackaged in a new digital platform. It just tells you that the platform is 2019. So it is all sorts of facts about itself.
Sorry, could you still click on the details column there for us to see what it contains? So exactly.
Tells you nothing. It tells you that it's a reproduction of a copy in the Huntington Library. It tells you that it had a real position. So yes, it tells you that it was a microfilm once, but only if you bother to read down that and infer that from the fact it says it has a real position. It tells you that it was last updated in 2020. But it doesn't tell you, it doesn't give you an accurate bibliographical history of the document that you're seeing at all. It's very unsatisfactory. I suspect the majority of users of this database are unaware of the fact that they are seeing images taken 45 years ago or even older, actually.
Scott, you just nailed another nail in the coffin of our hopes that we can do research online during the pandemics.
There is one question on YouTube which still relates to it relates to fake. It is a follow by Mateus Monteiro, and he asked whether there are also books that can have a fake or misleading coverage that would try to hide what's inside.
Oh yes. Well, yes, of course there are books that are like that. I don't happen to have any to hand. I mean, there are many books, of course, whose cover tells you nothing about what's inside. It's just a cover, and I've shown you several of those already. I mean, the closest example I have I have of that to hand is this book, which I must show you because it's very nice. So this is a this book, which indeed tells you nothing about what it is on its cover. Slightly strange shape, but it looks like a nicely bound copy of it's in a nice 17th century English binding, and it's an original binding. In fact, it's an original binding made for the stationer Luke Fawn, who was giving the book, which is why it's a nice binding, to the master of Peterhouse for the college library, Lazarus Seaman, who was one of Luke Fawn's best customers. He's a major book collector. But of course, the book, as you can see if you read the inscription, the book is a Chinese almanac. It's not supposed to be bound in gilt Morocco by an English binder. And it's not supposed to be given away in 1645. It's supposed to be thrown away in the second half of 1627, which is when it stops being useful. So this is certainly a book which isn't advertising what it is from its cover, and which is, in this particular form, probably the only example of that book to survive. So, I mean, there's probably no other example of that book with bound by this binder, and this binder would be, I mean, in theory at least, identifiable. The vogue for Chinese books in England is a little bit later, actually. This is the earliest recorded Chinese book in a Cambridge library. So in a sense, that answers the question, but it's not intending to deceive, whereas, of course, you could intend to deceive. I mean, I acquired the other day a book from a French, reasonably well-known late 16th, early 17th century French library, which contained bound within it an edition of Hugo Grotius's poems, from which the title page had been removed. And I assume the title page was removed because of Grotius by that stage was on the index. And the book doesn't reveal that it contains Grotius's poems at all, in no way. It has a title on the spine, it has a list of the contents, but it includes all the rest of the books that are bound together, but not that. So that is possibly an intent to deceive, or an intent to preserve from prying eyes, anyway, what's in one's library. And censorship is one of the things that promotes that. Obviously, there are other reasons that promote that, including the desire to have fun. So yes, there are books whose covers deliberately mislead or accidentally mislead.
We have one question on this on YouTube, and then Professor Garber has a note on this. So on YouTube, I have a question from Erodika-san, who wants to know what we can learn from a book, or whether we can learn from a book without reading it, if it has been censored. So what can we learn in terms of censorship? And then I think Professor Garber has a note on the same thing.
Yes, hang on a second. The straightforward answer is the way in which you can know whether a book has been censored is whether it tells you, and that does involve a small amount of reading. So that this book, for example, has been censored, and it even has a reproduction in print of the censor's signature. That is, this is one of the volumes of the Antwerp Polyglot Bible, all of which have the statement of correctness of the editor of the Bible, Benito Arias Montano, and his mark. And of course, he was not only the editor of the Bible, he was an official censor. And by marking the book in this way, he is demonstrating that it has the approval of the index, which is unsurprising given that it has the patronage of the King of Spain and everything else. So, I mean, one way of telling whether a book has been censored is whether it has a censor's imprimatur of one kind or another, in which case it has been passed. You will find the same manuscript imprimaturs in some books which have officially been through the hands of a censor, so which have been censored, for example, on importation, or in some other way during their passage through the book trade. Obviously, you'll also find books which have been censored, most commonly by people crossing off the names of authors or obliterating the names of authors, sometimes also by textual intervention, sometimes, as I indicated in my comments earlier, by tearing pages out, by their readers or by their owners. And of course, the publication of the publication of the index is designed to enable you to know if you should censor the books in your library and how you should censor them if you are a good Tridentine Catholic. So you, yes, I mean, you can identify. You don't usually need to read the book to see if it's been censored, if it's a heretical book, because it will tell you. And if it isn't a heretical book and it's been published by somebody printing under the jurisdiction of the Holy Office or of the Congregation of the Index, it will tell you, because it will have a printed statement of that effect.
Professor Garwell?
Yeah, to come back to the earlier question about books with falsified titles and books with hidden contents, a famous instance of this, of course, is Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, which was published not only anonymously, but with a false city name and a false publisher on it. But in addition to that, recently the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton got a large collection of Spinoziana that included a number of copies of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus that were even more hidden. So you open it up and there will be a completely different title page, and there'll be 15 or 20 pages of a completely different book. And then you'll come upon the text of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus somewhere, maybe a quarter of the way into the book. So that you have to know that the book is there in order to find it.
Yes, one of the reasons why I brought this little book out, as well as to function and for the uses I've already given, was exactly the same, very much the same as Dan has just said, because this is a book, although it's a book in a book in Italian, and it really is a book in Italian, as you can see, and it claims to be printed in Naples. It is in fact written by Andrew Fletcher of Saltoun and was in fact printed in Edinburgh, and isn't really about Spain, but is really about critical political theory with regard to, as much as anything, to the prospective union or otherwise of England and Scotland. So, I mean, as Dan says, there is plenty of well, there's plenty of playing around with these issues.
Why would he have written it in Italian? Just to hide the content?
Well, it's a complicated joke, I think. I mean, the idea that somebody, because of course somebody in Naples, which is one of the possessions of the King of Spain, be writing critically about the relationship between Naples and Spain. So it's a sort of analogy, and it's a sort of joke, and it's also, of course, a piece of virtuoso display as well.
Yeah. And it would have been intelligent. Well, Italian was a language that cultured people could read, and so it would have been accessible to an appropriate audience.
Yeah.
Just one more point on digitization. Do you think that a good digital edition of manuscripts, let's say the Newton Project, makes a printed edition of the same manuscript superfluous?
Just let me find something to share, and I'll do that.
Let me just add to Grigore's question, because we had a kind of exchange, very short, brief exchange, in which I said it's impossible to make a sort of edition of Newton's complete works, and he said no, it's not. So that's a possible background. Can we make a printed edition of Newton's complete work, or is it better to have a digital edition of Newton's everything that he ever wrote?
If Leibniz is possible, then I think Newton is also possible.
Leibniz may not be possible.
Oops.
But why either or? Why not the both? Not have them both?
Well,
why this difference?
I mean, if we look at what I put on the screen, this is some sort of scrap of various scraps of Newtoniana and manuscript. These have been edited. They've been edited by Tom Whiteside. They haven't been edited in the form that they appear here. So in some cases, they appear simply as footnotes in Whiteside's edition. In some cases, they're texts that Whiteside used. They relate, as indeed this rather helpful description, which it seems to have been written by Niccolo Giucciardini and me, tells you, they're related to other manuscripts of Newton, which are also extremely difficult to use. I wonder what happens if we go there. That's what happens, and you probably can't even see it. I mean, you can do all sorts of things with with a digital edition. And apart from anything else, you can probably eventually manage to read it if you play around with it enough, although I usually find that I can't read it when it's magnified enough because I lose the ability to control it on the screen, but that's another matter. I mean, yes, one could reproduce at some level all of these fragments and all of these versions in print. I'm not sure what one would learn from it. Oops, that's exactly what always happens with me. No, I wanted to go back, which isn't. I mean, clearly this, even with this sort of thing, doesn't substitute for a proper edition of the text. Apart from anything else, it still requires you to be pretty conversant. Well, it requires you, in this case, to be able to read Latin, and it requires you to be pretty conversant with Newton's notation and with all sorts of other things. And a good edition of the text may make that slightly less obscure. Obviously, also a good edition of the text will make apparent what is concealed here, even though you're given hyperlinks that help you, which is relationships between manuscripts and texts and relationships between drafts. And a digital edition won't necessarily substitute for that. So I mean, yes, in an ideal world, you probably want to have both. Although, of course, you don't have to have a printed version of the edition. You could present that electronically as well. But just having a good browser and photographs of the manuscript is probably not enough, or not enough for anything which is complicated. But then you see, I'm not sure that I think it's enough for a printed book either. I've been trying to suggest to you that you might want more information than is given to you by a good browser and photographs of the printed book.
Our last question from our YouTube audience is by Carmen Bucur, which asks, which is the newest acquisition of the library in terms of this kind of books? If you are comfortable with telling us.
I've shown it to you, although it wasn't that new. I mean, it's a little bit over a year old. I haven't bought. It's this Cambridge book of Cambridge congratulatory verses in a Cambridge binding. That's the I bought that for the library, I think, in February 2019. We've acquired some things since then, but nothing that fits quite as well as this. I wouldn't have bought this book if it hadn't been in a contemporary Cambridge binding, if it hadn't been an example of what it was. I also bought it though, because it was a book issued during the Vice-Chancellorship and, in a sense, with the publication of John Cousin, who was master of Peterhouse, and we didn't have it. So I bought it for reasons that were both textual and to do with its cover. But I probably wouldn't have bought a copy without the binding. I certainly wouldn't have paid as much money as I did.
You're muted, Anna.
Yes, okay. Scott, thank you so much for allowing us to enter again in a library, even if in this virtual format. It has been a wonderful evening. We have seen a lot of marvels, and there are a lot of very interesting questions on the table, of which to me the most important is how are we going to do research in the following months. But
yes, but when you are allowed to travel, of course, you must come and visit the library and visit the books themselves, which will be much more enjoyable than seeing them in this form.
But so far we have seen some of them, we have had a glimpse of them, so that thank you very much for this. And thank you all for being with us tonight, both on Zoom and on the YouTube. It has been a wonderful exploration and investigation It was good to play book detectives together. Scott, thank you. Thank
The
you.
opportunity, Dana.
See you next week. Bye-bye.